Well, welcome again to our study on the book of Isaiah. I'm excited to be with you today going through our study. And before we get started, though, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard the word goat before? I'm not talking about sheep and goats. A few years ago, I was working with college students, and one of them said that I was a goat, and I was kind of offended. And I was like, "What does that mean?" But I found out that I'm just old and don't know the slang from a few years ago. And what it was is GOAT is the greatest of all time. And so I got thinking about that. You know, there are some great rivalries in our time. Who's the greatest? Is it LeBron or is it Jordan? Is it Chevy or is it Ford? Is it Marvel or is it DC? I don't know maybe what you may be thinking about, the two great rivalries and two great comparisons. Well, today we're going to look at the book of Isaiah, and we're going to see that when it comes to God, there is no comparison. He is the creator and the sustainer. He is the one true God, and nothing can compare to him. Nothing can hold a candle to him. And he is going to prove that he is worthy, that he is trustworthy, that he is dependable. And as we dive into Isaiah today, I hope you'll be able to see that's who God is, and that's who we can depend on as we see that God renews us. God renews those who he disciplines. In the book of Isaiah, we have two major sections. And we're moving from the first major section into the second major section. Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 focus on God's judgment. We hear a lot about the Assyrians during that time. And then through the rest of the book, 40 forward, we see a focus on God's renewal, God's bringing the people back in the land. And we talk a lot about Babylon. There's a reason for that. The Assyrians are prominent in judging the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians are prominent in judging and disciplining the southern kingdom. You see, what happened was last week we talked about God driving the Assyrians away from Jerusalem. They come in, they had mocked him, and he sent them away. And in the process, though, he began to raise up Babylon as a great empire. And Hezekiah hosted some emissaries from Babylon, and they came in, they looked around, and Hezekiah was proud, and he showed them all his great treasures. Well, eventually Babylon didn't forget those great treasures, and they came back to get them at some point later. And they took all the Israelites, or all the people in Judah, took most of them off to captivity. They left some of the land, and that's a different story, but they took a lot of them off to captivity for 70 years. And after that time, God brought them back. But even before God sent them off with the Babylonians, Isaiah is prophesying about them coming back. So we're looking not just to the future, but to way in the future. And Isaiah is going to be prophesying about what God is promising to do after his discipline, his promise to renew the nation, to renew the people after he's disciplined them. So let's begin by looking at Isaiah chapter 40, verses 18 through 20. And I want you to visualize what's taking place in these verses. With whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? An idol? Something that a smelter cast and a metal worker plates with gold and makes silver chains for? A poor person contributes wood for the pedestal that will not rot. He will look for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. Now, in the first half of this chapter, God is extolled for his greatness and his unique nature. Then when we get to chapter 14, Isaiah gets a little bit sarcastic with the people when he's talking about idols that have to be created for worship. This idea of likeness that is used in this verse, it harkens us back to creation. God created humanity in his likeness, and he's trying to demonstrate the foolish nature of humans who are created by God, using material that is created by God to make an image to worship instead of the God who created all that stuff. And so metaphors in the Bible really help us understand. We compare and contrast things to help us understand more about who God is, understand more about God's nature. And so I want us to do this activity that I have for us to help us understand more about God. I want you to look up Psalm 18, verse 20, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, and John chapter 6, verse 35. And how are the truths that are represented in these metaphors different from what we see in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 18 through 20? So I'll give you a few minutes to look those up and think on that. Now, God is a spirit, He is not some marble statue standing in a pavilion. God is not some little golden statue that's placed on a mantelpiece somewhere. Now, Israel did build a temple, and we see temples all over the ancient Near East. And if you've ever been to Greece or Rome, you've seen temples there. But when Israel built their temple, they didn't put a statue in it. God told them, don't put a statue of me in there, because what is there to represent? I'm a spirit. And God does manifest himself in that temple. God manifests himself in a little room in the center of the temple that only one person went in once a year. And once a year, God would manifest himself on top of a little box in that little room to show that he is who he says he is and that he can atone for people's sins. And so God doesn't need a statue built out of metal or out of wood or out of marble. And Isaiah says it is absurd to think that we can create for ourselves an idol when we have a God to worship who's like the God you just read about in those verses in that last activity. And God does not want us to be beholden to something that we've made out of something that he created. He says it just doesn't make any sense. Well, God's going to go on in the next few verses, and he's going to make a point about him being the creator of the world, the universe, everything that there is. So let's look at verses 21 through 26. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not considered the foundations of the earth? God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like thin clouds and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He reduces princes to nothing and makes judges of the earth like a wasteland. They are barley planted, barley sown. They are stems hardly taken root in the ground. When he blows on them, and they wither, and a whirlwind carries them away like stubble. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal? Asked the Holy One. Look up and see. Who created these? He brings out the stars by number. He calls all of them by name because of his great power and strength. Not one of them is missing. Now here God is comparing his power as the creator of the universe. But before we dive into this, I want you to consider this question. Why might people be tempted to look to created things for strength and safety instead of the creator God? So in this passage, God declares himself greater than human governments, greater than false gods, greater than the created universe. These are all things that we sometimes depend on for our protection, for our strength, solve our problems. It's also some things that we sometimes worship. You might not think we worship government, you might not think we worship false gods or the created universe, but sometimes and throughout history we have worshiped those things. Caesar declared himself a god. All throughout history, people have set up idols. And all throughout history, people have gone out and they have worshipped the nature around them. So we're going to look at three different things here. In verse 21 and 22, we see that God uses the universe as his tool. Some worship the universe, some worship creation. God says, I use creation, I use the universe as a tool. Many times in the ancient Near East, it was thought that the gods would fight each other. You know, these different gods from these different countries and whatnot would fight each other. And they would even create the world or had created the world from the bodies of the dead gods, the ones that were defeated. Sometimes the thought was that a god would create the world from parts of himself. And therefore, in their thought, that in that way, the gods were subject to and affected by nature. And that's not the case with the Holy God of Israel. He created nature and he is not subject to it. He simply uses it as a tool. Verses 23 and 24 say governments are like the barley crop. God plants them, God raises them up, God uses them, and then God lets them go their way or to go away. You see, God isn't subject to the government. God uses governments. God uses nations. And he says here in this verse that he can reduce princes to nothing. This idea, the language here points us back again to creation, to the idea of something being formless and void. God can raise up a government out of chaos, produce peace and stability for a time period, and then God can do away with it. Your mama says, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it. That's what God says about governments. He says, I don't need them. I'm not subject to them, but they are my tool. I can use them. And so we move on into verses 25 and 26. And he says here that he knows every single star. In ancient times, stars were thought to be gods. In 2 Kings chapter 17, we see a time when people bowed down and worshiped the stars instead of God. And even today, people use stars through their horoscopes to understand who they are as a person, to understand what their future is. And some of us may mock that and look at that, but that is a very common thing in our culture, especially among young people. And so even today, the stars hold this idea of being godlike or divine or spiritual in some way. And God says, you think those stars are so great. You want to bow down and worship them. You want to look to them for your future. He says, I know each and every one of them. I created each and every one of them. And I know where they are. I know the names of them. We don't even know all the stars out there. But God says, I know each and every one of them. And to name something in the Bible, in the ancient Near East, is to have dominion over it. And so Adam named the animals. He had dominion over them. God says, I have dominion over the stars. By saying I named them, he says, I have dominion over them. I want you to look at Romans chapter 1, verses 20 and 23. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Paul says the greatness of creation should point us to God. If you see these posters behind me, they're from the national parks, and I get one for every national park that I visit. And if you've ever been to the Tetons, if you've been to Yosemite, if you've been underground at Carlsbad Caverns or Mammoth Caves, wherever you've been, if you've been to those places and beheld the majesty of the mountain view or the majesty of being underground and examining the stalactites and the stalagmites and seeing the wonders of God's created order, you might have been awed by him and awed by what you saw. But you don't have to go far. You don't have to go to a national park. You can, if you've been out on Black Lake, or if you've been out to Cobb Well or the Moody Stretch out there maybe early in the morning when there's still a little fog out and about, or if you've been out there even at noonday and just experienced the great sun that comes out and been out there in the nature, you can experience God's greatness and experience God's hand at work. And Paul says these wonders should point us to the sovereign Creator. Go with me to Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. He, that is Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything that was created by him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones, dominions, or rulers, or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. For he is before all things, and by him all things hold together. Here we see that not only did God create the universe, but God, through Christ, holds the universe together. I used to use the analogy that if God stopped breathing, everything would stop being. Now, God can't stop being, but just think on that for a second. God holds everything together. Have you ever maybe shattered a vase or something, or broke a mug, and you're just like kind of got it in your hand? It's like, if I let go, it's all going to fall apart. Well, that's kind of what we have here is Christ is holding the world together, and if he let go, everything would fall apart. Consider this question. How does knowing that God is the creator and is directing the affairs of his creation affect your daily life, or how might it affect it if you really thought about God in that way? While we are insignificant in a lot of ways compared to God, we can find hope and we can find strength in the fact that we know that we have been created by and are cared for by the same sovereign God who created the mountains, who created the valleys, who created the canyons out there. That same God who created the stars cares for us, and he created us. Let's keep going and look at verses 27 through 31 of Isaiah chapter 40. Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my claim is ignored by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the whole earth. He never becomes faint or weary. There is no limit to his understanding. He gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Youths may become faint and weary. Young men stumble and fall, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. Now, verse 27 is an accusation against the people for disparaging God for being unwilling or unable to help them. They're saying, God, you don't want to help us, or God, you're not able to help us. And it's not wrong for us, though, to bring our questions to God, to even bring our doubts sometimes to God. What's wrong here and what we see here is not people who are saying, God, I don't understand why. It's people saying, God, you're unwilling. They got a fist raised to God saying, you don't want to help me, or you can't help me. And that's what God is coming to them saying, you don't talk, that's not the way we do things. That's not how we talk about me, because you don't need to be disparaging my character. And in verse 28, things shift just a little bit. And God, before God was extolling his character and his attributes as a reason to worship him. Now he takes that and he says, here are my characteristics, here are my attributes, and now you can trust me when you know those things. He says, I don't get tired. You might get worn down. I don't. You can trust me. You might have folks in your life you can't trust, but you can trust me. I will move you forward in life toward the future I have for you, through the difficulties I have for you. I'll move you through those. You can trust me. Just trust me. I can do it. I'm willing and I'm able to do that. Remember, he's talking to a people who are looking around going, I don't know how we got here. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happened. And where's God in all this? God says, you can trust me. You can just sit and wait. Now, it may not happen today. It may not happen tomorrow, but you can trust me. Remember, Isaiah is looking forward to a future after they've been taken into captivity. And he's saying, after this time, you can trust that God's going to bring you back into the land. And he's saying to us today, we can trust God. We might not be able to see into the future. We might not be able to see where we're eventually going to land. But we can trust him to take us through that, be with us through that, and then bring us back, renew us in the process and through in the end. So let's end today with a recap and a challenge. So to recap where we were, all idols are human creations and fall short in comparison to the one true God. God alone is creator of the universe, directing the affairs of his creation. And lastly, God strengthens those who place their trust in him. And now for our challenge. I want you to consider this week examining your life, looking for potential idols, things you place more trust in than you do God. And this could be not just an idol on a shelf, but it could be a person, it could be a thing, it could be an attribute of yourself, something that you place before the Lord and trust in him more than you do him. Confess your idolatry to God as you discover each idol, and consider what actions you might need to take to keep God first in your life. So again, thank you for joining me this week. I look forward to joining you next week as we continue through our study in the book of Isaiah.